So to understand this current state of UK politics, the best way to describe it is in one word, and that's just chaos. And this is summed up in this Financial Times article by George Parker. So, as talks reach their crunch point, the Prime Minister faces a new rebellion from Eurosceptic members of her party who fear she favours a close relationship with the EU. Theresa May might have been out of the country last week on a 3-day trip to China, but for many in her Conservative Party, the Prime Minister has been absent for much longer. As she resumes her work in London on Monday, after a week in which chaos, at times bordering on farce, have enveloped her Brexit policy, Mrs May is rapidly facing the crunch point where she has to finally articulate what sort of relationship Britain wants with the EU. To govern is to choose, said Lord Briggs, former Brexit minister, urging Mrs May to get a grip on her cabinet, as her cabinet holds 2 key meetings this week to discuss the Brexit end state. The cover of the Conservative supporting Spectator magazine has simply said, lead or go. Civil servants are desperately seeking some kind of political lead. They have tried to fulfil a policy vacuum only to be accused by some Tories of pursuing an anti-Brexit agenda. But Nicholas Sloanes, a Tory grandee and Churchill's grandson, came to their defence when he says, no bad soldiers, only bad officers, he tweeted. Only a few weeks ago, Mrs May appeared to have brought some stability to the Brexit debate with the December interim agreement with the EU27 on budgetary issues and citizens' rights. But her government has been engulfed again in crisis, buffeted between a perceived absence of direction from 10 Downing Street and the growing fears among Eurosceptic Conservative MPs that the Prime Minister is likely to sell them out by backing a soft Brexit. While the country and the country and Brussels wait for Mrs May to outline her ideals for Britain's relationship with its biggest trading partner, the void has been filled by feuding cabinet ministers setting out differing versions of the future and by anxious civil servants trying to keep the show on the road. If you have a vacuum, something else always steps in to fill it, says Adam Summery, a pro-European Tory MP. In the absence of a clear lead from the top, Brexit has become a free-for-all. Last month, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, let it be known that he wanted a national Brexit dividend of over 100 million a week to be spent on the National Health Service, a demand even fellow Leave voters refused to endorse. Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, went to Davos to tell the global elite that Britain was seeking only very modest changes in its EU relationship. Number 10 said that neither the Foreign Secretary nor the Chancellor had been speaking for the government on Brexit. The question being asked in Brussels is, who is? There is a growing anxiety among Britain's top civil servants about the policy vacuum. If the Brexiteers had some kind of coherent vision, they could have set the agenda, says one in exasperation. Which they never have. This is one of the points that has been constantly made since the referendum. The Brexiteers and the guys who expect there's some sort to lead have no clear idea of what they want, what's going to happen, and what the plan is. Even Nigel Farage, his rhetoric, and that's all it is, cannot save him now. To try and focus ministerial minds, an economic assessment of the different Brexit options was drawn up by officials, but this has only compounded the farce. Ollie Robertson's, Mrs May's chief EU negotiator, pulled together work by government economists across Whitehall and asked senior officials to give private briefings to cabinet ministers deemed too sensitive for the public to see, let alone EU negotiators. Ministers were to be shown the documents in a closed room but would not be allowed to take them away. They've been done for a while, but we weren't allowed to see them, admits one of the cabinet ministers in charged with making the country's biggest economic decision since the Second World War. Inevitably, the papers were leaked to BuzzFeed. They confirm the speculation that whatever option Mrs May eventually chooses, Britain will be left worse off. Brexit Minister Steve Barker, a prominent Leaver, added to the disarray by rubbishing the official forecast, saying that they needed significant further work. Mr Baker's defensiveness at the Commons dispatch box reflects a growing fear among Brexiteers that Mrs May has gone silent because she is about to let them down by negotiating the kind of very modest Brexit suggested by Mr Hammond at Davos, which would keep Britain within the EU's orbit. Mr Johnson has told colleagues that he fears that a pro-European British establishment, including civil servants, is winning the argument. I'm sorry to say, but he's right, we are. Theresa May, a former minister who campaigned for Brexit, warned last week that Brexit was being diluted, stating that with the proposition transitional deal of around 2 years, concluded entirely on Brussels terms, the phrase "Beano," Brexit in name only, is frequently on the Tory lips. One senior Tory MP said, "The whole thing is unravelling and pressure is growing on the Prime Minister." Another Brexiteer said that he and his colleagues were having regular meetings with the Chief Whip, Julian Smith, who was in listening mode and passing it all on to Number 10, all of our concerns. What we need to see is a change in tone and activity from the negotiating team, the Brexiteer said. Our gripe is with the way the negotiations are going, and this does fall to Theresa May as the leader to get it back on track. And I don't know what these guys are actually expecting, because we have no leverage. For all this talk about how great our economy is that's talked up by Brexiteers, and the fact that they said continually that, oh, we have all these cards to play, they've been shown that actually all these cards are nothing, that they have no cards to hold, and that Britain is not a strong country compared to the 27 combined economic power and negotiating skills of the EU 27. The Brexiteers' ebbing confidence seems to stem particularly from the fact that there is no united front among the pro-Leave cabinet ministers on what exactly the end state of Britain's EU relationship should be. This is exactly what I said before. They have no endgame. They never had one. Mr Johnson, formerly an articulate advocate of Brexit in newspaper columns, favoured the cleanest of breaks, but fellow ministers say he eschews detail at cabinet meetings. He just waves his arms around and talks about taking back control, says one cabinet member. Meanwhile, David Davis, the pro-Leave Brexit secretary, has formed an unlikely alliance with Mr Hammond and has repeatedly favoured soft Brexit options intended to minimise the impact of exit on businesses. Last month he was accused by Jacob Rees-Mogg, a Tory MP, who now chairs the party's pro-Leave faction, of negotiating a transitional deal that would leave Britain a vassal state beholden to Brussels, lawmakers and Luxembourg judges. Mrs May told reporters last week that the transitional deal would be a period of practical implementation, and denied reports that Mr Robbins had told EU negotiators that Britain wanted to stretch it for 3 years. We are not talking about something that goes on and on, she said. But veteran European watchers note that in Brussels, temporary agreements tend to last longer than the first anticipated. I think 3 to 5 years, says Charles Grant, Director for Centre of European Reform. Privately, officials concur that it would take longer than December 2020. The transitional expiry date set by the EU's lead Brexit negotiator, Michael Barnier, for Britain and the EU to put in place a new customs agreement. That, of course, if it's Mrs May actually decides that Britain wants to fully break out of the customs union framework. And apparently this is what she wants to do, which basically means we are going to have a longer transitional agreement than 2020. Tory Eurosceptics fear that when Britain exits the transition, Mrs May will end up with a final settlement that includes such a close customs deal with the EU, perhaps a full customs union on goods, that it severely restricts Britain's ability to have an independent trade policy after Brexit. Well, that is the option being pursued by the pro-European elite in Whitehall, notably the Treasury, armed with forecasts to support their continuation that no third country trade deals with the US or other parties will make up for exports Britain would lose if it were to put up barriers with its biggest market in Europe. According to the BuzzFeed leaks, any Brexit scenario would result in loss of growth over the next 15 years, with the estimates ranging from 2% to the lower under the Norway-style deal, an option that was being rejected by Mrs May, and 8% under a hard Brexit, a no-deal scenario in which Britain traded with the EU on World Trade Organization terms. These gains might have been secured from new third. These gains that might have been secured from new third country trade deals, one of the biggest prizes of Brexit, according to Leavers, are expected by government and economists to be modest at best. Even a trade deal with the US would only benefit us by about 0.2% in the long term, according to the papers. Trade deals with other non-European countries, such as China, India and Australia and the Gulf states, would add only a further 0.1 to 0.4% GDP. Caroline Fairbairn, the head of the CBI Employees Federation, noted that on Mrs May's visit to China last week that Britain was already unable to trade well with third countries from within the EU. Indeed, Mrs May trumpeted the $9 billion of UK-China deals that Mrs Fairbairn believes that Britain should stay in the customs union and with the EU until such a time, if it comes, that third-party trade deals are signed and make up for the loss of trade with Europe. But we know they're not. That's the thing. Remaining a member of the customs union for as long as it serves us would do so. To do so is consistent with the result of the referendum and would be good for the EU firms too. Miss Fairbairn said in her speech last month, "One Downing Street confirms is the option on the table, but amidst the problems of selling it to the party is a tightrope." And this is the problem we are seeing. We are seeing people play party politics over what is actually the best interest for the nation. Mrs May's silence on Brexit and her general lack of grip on government has reignited talk of a possible coup against the Prime Minister before she can get to negotiate the outline of a future EU-UK relationship. Talks are scheduled to start in the spring and conclude by the end of the year. "It's a bit messy and she's a lame duck," says another Tory Eurosceptic MP. "There's a very big leadership vacuum. Johnny Mercer, a rising star of the Tory party, says, 'We need to do better or we will pay the price.'" Well, we're already going to pay the price, it doesn't matter. Grant Sharples, another former party chairman, said that Mrs May should set a date for her departure to draw a line under her uninspiring leadership. However, Sir Graham Brady, chairman of the Backbench 1922 committee, has downplayed suggestions of an imminent vote of no confidence that will be triggered if 48 Conservative MPs, 15% of the total, challenged her leadership. Among the party MPs, there is still a working assumption that she will survive to take Britain out of the EU in March 2019. "The fundamentalists haven't changed since last June," says one party Gardaí, pointing out that Mrs May only survived as Prime Minister after last summer's election setback because the alternatives seemed much worse. These included a chaotic leadership contest with no clear replacement on offer, the prospect of a renewed civil war on Europe a total breakdown in party unity and possible early general election. For conservative Eurosceptics, there is a nagging fear that a leadership contest might unleash such unpredictable forces that the party could tumble out of power and Brexit might not happen at all. And Labour's position on Europe is deliberately opaque. As at Brussels summit as seen at the Brussels summit last summer in October, at a session of European leaders after Mrs May had left, it was agreed that the EU should try and help the British Prime Minister because of fears she might be ousted in favour of someone much less to their taste, like Mr Johnson. Mrs May's weakness has since last year's botched election has so far paradoxically been a strength, because even her critics fear that removing her will make things worse. However, that sentiment could change if the shambles over Brexit policy continues much longer. Miss Sudbury agrees that the patience of the party's Eurosceptic wing could run out if the Prime Minister is deemed to be selling out on Brexit. They won't hesitate to stab her in the back. It's as simple as that, she says. So that is literally the current state. It's complete chaos. Not complete anarchy, but it's insane to say that actually her strength is actually, if she went, the unknown sheer chaos that would happen. Because who would set up to lead? Particularly, as I've said before, Brexit is a poison chalice and no one wants to drink from it. Because after, they can get rid of her. Oh, after Brexit, I guarantee you, they'll get rid of her. And all the blame will be placed on her. Not these, or they'll be like, oof, if I was in charge. Make that a point when they come to election time, whoever it might be. When they make the claims of, oh, if I was in charge, this wouldn't happen, or I was warning of these things that might happen. Well, we know Britain's going to be worse off. We know that. That's undeniable. And it's going to be shooting ourselves in the foot because there are going to be so much other unforeseen circumstances and other consequences to Brexit, which we've covered in other videos. So things are going to get worse, and enjoy, as I keep on saying, the last couple of good years in terms of economy, job creation. If you think austerity is bad now, even if, let's say we went with a 2% option, 2% is a lot of money to lose from the GDP, and these other trade agreements, they mean nothing. As I've always said at the beginning, it's all about distance. You always trade with your closest partner, and our closest trading partner is Europe. That will not change. Britain is not going to pull up anchor and somehow sail away into the Caribbean or somewhere else. Like it or not, we are attached to Europe. That doesn't change. And us leaving the EU, there's going to be other consequences further down the line in terms of trade agreements, tariffs, things that we won't even be allowed to have a say on because we no longer have a say in the process. So, yeah, enjoy. And all I can say is, we told you so, continually. We told you so before the referendum, we told you so after the referendum. There were experts warning and telling you about consequences, but you chose to ignore them. Because you fell for stupid lines like take back control, which means nothing. And sovereignty. We already have sovereignty. We haven't lost it. We still have it.